Nightfall once meant safety in Texarkana, the cool air after a long day, and the comfort of a routine. But in 1946, darkness became something else entirely. And from the edges of Lover's Lane to the windows of farmhouses, a faceless predator stalked the innocent. And he didn't leave a name or a trace, only bodies and fear. But the town gave him a name, the Phantom. And what began as a single strange attack soon grew into a reign of terror that pushed an entire community into hysteria. And his shadow still hangs over Texarkana today. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I put a little sauce on it today for you. How'd you like that? Also, I'm sick. Sorry in advance for if I sound nasally. I will try to mitigate any coughing and sniffling for this. But yes, we are talking about a case that is just haunting overall. So, without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this Texarkana case together. Texarkana in 1946 was actually two cities bound together by name and culture. Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas, or Arkansas. Why is Arkansas called Arkansas and Kansas called Kansas? Shouldn't it be Kansas then? Why? Make it make sense, people. All right. But anyway, together they had around a little more than 40,000 residents, and the population was majority white, around 66%, in fact, but with a very large African-American minority, which was about 31%. And they were living under the harsh restrictions of Jim Crow segregation. And this was a community where the racial divides of the South were firmly in place, dictating everything from schools to social spaces. Yet, on the surface, Texarkana was a typical friendly Southern town, because World War II had just ended, bringing an economic boom, and massive military installations like the Red River Army Depot and the Lone Star Ammunition Plant had sprung up nearby during the war, pumping money and jobs into that area. So the war's end meant thousands of young men and hometown soldiers were returning. And many of these veterans carried invisible wounds, what we know now as PTSD. But in those days, there was little, if any, recognition or treatment for combat fatigue. It was basically suck it up or go to the loony bin back then. So they came back to a community that still felt safe and innocent. The kind of place where people left doors unlocked and spent warm evenings on their front porches sipping iced tea. And the location and time would suggest Texarkana residents considered their town peaceful and God-fearing. So in 1946, Texarkana's social life was vibrant in its own wholesome way. On weekends, young people flocked to community dances, especially those hosted by local VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. And a popular attraction was a band called Jerry Atkins and his Rhythmaries, which played swing music for returning soldiers and their sweethearts. And movies were another big draw, and downtown theaters screened the latest films. And a recent horror flick like House of Dracula might have been the scariest thing on anyone's mind before 1946. And maybe the war that just happened also. And teenagers also enjoyed cruising drive-in restaurants and spending time at secluded lovers' lanes on the edges of town, where couples could park under the moonlight and do the devil's tango, if you will, or play checkers. I don't know what they were doing, all right? And for those seeking an even spicier nightlife, there were a few rough nightclubs / roadhouses with girly floor shows, but those were on the fringes. But overall, Texarkana's entertainment scene was likely typical of a small southern town. It's a modest, besides the fringes of town, community-orientated, and very safe. And people felt comfortable just going out at night. But no one could imagine that within months, their town would be gripped by terror, with nightfall bringing fear instead of music and laughter. So on Friday night, February 22nd, 1946, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jean Larry, parked on a lonely dirt lane off Richmond Road on the Texas side of town. And it was nearly midnight, and the area was known as a lover's lane. And it was about 300 feet from the nearest house. And the young couple had just seen a movie downtown and just wanted a little privacy. So in the still darkness, their car's headlights were off, and the two were likely lost in conversation or embrace, so they did not notice when a car pulled up and parked nearby. And suddenly, a blinding flashlight beam pierced the driver's side window, and a figure stood there. A man wearing a white cloth mask that looked like a pillowcase with eye holes. And he was also armed with a pistol. So Jimmy and Mary Jean would freeze in shock as the masked intruder barked commands at them, saying,
"I don't want to kill you, so do what I say."
And he would order them out of the car. And Jimmy fumbled to comply. And that's when the attacker gave a bizarre demand. And he would tell Jimmy to
"Take off your goddamn britches."
And confused but terrified, Jimmy removed his pants. And without warning, the man slammed the butt of his gun into Jimmy's skull. 2 absolutely savage blows. And the impact was so loud that Mary Jean later said she thought it was a gunshot, but it would be the sound of Jimmy's skull fracturing. Just absolutely brutal. So Jimmy would naturally collapse to the ground with a cracked skull, stunned, but still alive. And the assailant would then turn on to Mary Jean. And Mary Jean frantically showed him a wallet, pleading that they had no money, assuming that this was a robbery of some sort. But the man wasn't interested in cash. Instead, he struck Mary Jean with the pistol, knocking her down, and the attacker then told Mary Jean to stand up. And he would say,
"Run."
So Mary Jean would stumble away in a blind panic down the road, but the man chased her and caught up to her, angrily accusing her of trying to escape when he had told her to run in the first place. I can't even imagine the terror that was going through Mary Jean's head at this point. And in that eerie moment, it became clear he was toying with her or tormenting her for sport. And he would beat her again, and then in an act of pure cruelty would her with the barrel of the gun. And Mary Jean's pain and terror was unimaginable at this point. But then, suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, and the assailant would realize he was about to be caught, and he would vanish into the darkness, slipping away as quickly as he appeared. And Mary Jean eventually managed to get help by reaching a nearby house, and Jimmy, despite his severe head injuries, had regained consciousness and flagged down a passerby on the road. And by 12:30 a.m., Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley and several officers arrived on the scene. So both victims were rushed to the hospital, and Jimmy in critical condition with multiple skull fractures, and Mary Jean with head wounds and profound trauma. But incredibly and luckily, both people survived the attack. So they had looked their attacker in the face, or at least in the face of his mask, and lived to tell the tale. And in the days that followed, Sheriff Presley tried to get detailed descriptions of the assailant from the victims. But even this turned strange, because Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry gave conflicting accounts of their attacker's race and appearance. Mary Jean insisted the man was African American, saying she glimpsed dark skin through the eye holes of the mask. But Jimmy, however, was convinced the man was white, perhaps a tanned white man around 30 years old. And he wasn't even certain the guy wore a mask at all. But both agreed on one point, and that is that the attacker was about 6 feet tall. So these discrepancies unsettled investigators. Some officers wondered if the young couple might actually know their attacker and were covering for him in some weird way, which is, why would you cover for a guy that literally almost killed both of them? But they were just perplexed on how different the descriptions were. But I mean, you're looking at the one guy got his skull beat in with the butt of a gun. Like, you can't trust somebody who's just had their skull beaten in with a gun. And also, Mary Jean also had her skull hit with the gun. I feel like it's, obviously you have to get these descriptions, but I feel like it's not that far-fetched to believe that they're both like completely out of their wits on what actually happened, given, that their skulls were beaten with the butt of a gun. Different times though, what do I know? But overall, it did appear that the two had been brutally attacked at random, if it wasn't one of their buddies. Again, weird theory. I don't like it. And before Jimmy Hollis was even out of the hospital, he made a prophetic statement to Sheriff Presley, saying,
"If you don't find him, he's going to kill someone."
So Jimmy feared the crazed man who nearly beat him to death would strike again. And this time, the victims might not be so lucky. So Sheriff Bill Presley faced an immediate challenge investigating the Hollis-Larry attack. And in 1946, criminal forensics was rudimentary by modern standards, and Presley's small-town department was not equipped with advanced labs. And forensic work mostly meant taking eyewitness statements and maybe comparing bullet casings or fingerprints by visual inspection. There was no computers or DNA back then, as you know. But still, the sheriff took the case very, very seriously. And he publicly warned citizens to be cautious, but initially he stopped short of linking this incident to anything bigger. In fact, local newspapers and police at first treated it as an isolated, if bizarre, assault. And the media began to report the incident with headlines such as,
"Insurance agent, girl assaulted on lonely dirt road."
However, Presley did not forget Jimmy Hollis's ominous warning. And unbeknownst to everyone, the nightmare was only beginning. And the hooded man in the shadows was still out there. And as Jimmy feared, he was about to kill. I think this is a good spot to take a pause, a breather. We're getting into very, very heavy stuff. And during this pause, I would like to share something personal with you. For years, I have suffered with severe jaw pain, and it's because of my teeth. And over the past few years, I started noticing I was waking up more and more often with jaw tension, and my dentist actually pointed out some wear on my molars. And it turns out all that stress and anxiety had me clenching my jaw without even realizing it. So the stressors of life were literally affecting my sleep and my teeth, and I didn't even know it. And that is when I literally discovered Remy. And if you're part of the 30% of Americans who grind their teeth like me, then your smile needs protection, because we only get one set of teeth. And there's no better solution than Remy's custom fit night guard. Both dentists and teeth grinders recommend Remy because a custom fit night guard is the best way to protect your teeth. And Remy is 80% less than the dentist and way easier. And here's how it works. They send you an impression kit straight to your door with a step-by-step instructions to get your perfect impression. And then Remy ships you your custom fit night guard made right here in the US in Las Vegas. And I honestly was very skeptical about doing dental impressions at home, but the instructions were really clear and the process was actually kind of satisfying. And when my night guard arrived, the fit was absolutely perfect and way more comfortable than I ever expected. And the best part is that Remy is so confident you'll get a perfect fit that they offer a 45-night perfect fit guarantee or your money back. So no waiting rooms, no overpriced bills, just a better way to protect your teeth while you sleep. So try Remy risk-free at shopremy.com/CCCM and use code CCCM to get up to 50% off your night guard at checkout. That's 50% off at shopremy.com/CCCM with code CCCM. Thank you again to Remy for sponsoring this episode and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So only 1 month after the Hollis-Larry attack, the man struck again. And on Sunday morning, March 24th, 1946, the night of Saturday, March 23rd, leading into early March 24th to be specific, Texarkana would awake to the grim news of a double homicide. And the victims were Richard L. Griffin, who was 29, and his girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore, who was 17. So Richard Griffin was a war veteran from the Navy who had served his country and recently come home. And Polly Moore was a local high school girl, vivacious and just 17 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. And they had been dating for only 6 weeks. And on Saturday night, the couple went out on a typical date. Dinner or perhaps a midnight movie at Texarkana's Paramount Theater, then a late night stop at a diner for coffee. And sometime after 1 a.m. in the early hours of March 24th, they drove to a secluded lover's lane. And Richard parked in a wooded area about half a mile outside the city limits. And it was dark and damp and quiet. And there, in the pre-dawn stillness, the masked man found them. And at around 9 a.m. that Sunday, a passing motorist noticed a vehicle pulled off the road in an odd spot. And out of curiosity, he stopped to check if the car was broken down or if anyone inside needed help. But what he discovered made his blood run cold. And Richard Griffin and Polly Moore were dead, specifically to death inside of the car. And the motorist went off to find a phone and call the authorities immediately. And when officers arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Richard was in the front between the seats on his knees, head resting on his crossed hands, and pockets turned inside out. And Polly was sprawled face down in the back seat. And both had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. And blood soaked the ground nearby, and a .32 caliber cartridge casing was found, suggesting the murder weapon was a .32 handgun. And investigators deduced that the killer likely ambushed the couple while they sat in the car or just after they exited. And there were signs of struggle as well, because on one of the car's running boards, congealed blood indicated someone had bled heavily while climbing in or out. And a large patch of blood on the ground nearby, along with a blood trail, showed that Richard and Polly were probably shot outside the vehicle on a blanket and then dragged or positioned back in the car afterward. So this eerie staging, positioning the bodies as if peacefully resting, suggested the killer took his time after the murders. And the town obviously was horrified and shocked from this news. And rumors swirled that Polly had been amongst the brutal crime, because of the brutality seen in the Hollis Larry case. However, later reports indicated there was no sign of SA or any sort of torture in this double murder specifically. But still, the sheer viciousness and seeming randomness terrified everyone. And unfortunately, critical evidence from the Griffin war crime scene was lost or compromised before it could be properly collected. Just classic in those days. Just seems to happen just all the time. But news of the double murder spread like wildfire on that Sunday, and in the hours before police secured the site, curious locals and onlookers had tramped through the area like a bunch of idiots. I could say that now, they didn't know anything about DNA, but it's just frustrating. It's just frustrating. I feel like you know, though, not to go into a crime scene. I don't know. What do I know? And even worse is that an overnight rain had fallen, so that potentially washed away footprints or tire tracks that the killer could have potentially left. And by the time investigators combed the scene, they found only a few useful clues. Namely, the blood-soaked blanket and the trail of blood. No fingerprints were recovered on the car or the casing that could be traced to a suspect. And the killer had left virtually nothing behind except bullets and blood. So it was just a very dark foreshadowing, because he could strike and vanish without a trace, like a phantom, hence the name. In fact, the local press soon seized on that very word. But at this point in late March, the newspapers had not yet dubbed him the Phantom. That would come after the next killings. So with 2 people dead in cold blood, the Texarkana police forces realized that they had a killer on the loose, and urgently needed help. So the investigation immediately became a multi-agency effort, and law enforcement from both Texas and Arkansas, sorry, I actually didn't say that ironically. Anyway, coordinated since Texarkana straddled the state line and the killer clearly wasn't respecting any sort of jurisdiction. So the Texas side's Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley teamed up with Miller County, Arkansas officials. And the Texas Rangers sent their top men, including the famed captain, Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, to Texarkana. What a sick name. And the Arkansas State Police dispatched detectives like Max Tackett to assist. And even the FBI eventually became involved, helping with ballistics and fingerprint checks across state lines. But within days, there were dozens of officers working around the clock, and 20 additional state troopers from Arkansas were also brought in to bolster the local ranks. And investigators had their work cut out for them, because in 1946, there were no surveillance cameras and no DNA tests. And detectives relied on shoe leather and interviews. And by the end of the case, over 400 suspects would be questioned or arrested in connection with the murder as they chased every single lead. And forensic limitations meant they focused on ballistic matches specifically. Like the .32 caliber bullets from the Griffin Moore scene were compared under a microscope to see if they came from the same gun as any other known crime. But at this point, they didn't yet have another shooting to compare it to, because Hollis and Larry hadn't been shot, so they held onto the casings. And investigators also explored latent fingerprint evidence, and references in the FBI's vault materials suggest that fingerprints and biometrics were, indeed, part of the case file. But none of those prints matched any known criminals in their local files. So the Phantom had no record that they could find. He had never been imprisoned at this point, and he was still out there. But leads would pour in, and some well-meaning citizens flooded police with tips and accusations. And in those first frantic weeks, false confessions also began. And at least one man, and ultimately 9 individuals over the whole investigation, claimed to be the murderer. But these stories didn't check out. And local jails briefly held men picked up for questioning when they couldn't immediately explain their whereabouts. And as the case escalated, the press was getting more involved and the public just grew more fearful. Because after the first double murder, Texarkana realized with dread that Jimmy Hollis's warning had been right. A predator was stalking the town's lovers' lanes, and he was far from finished. So Bowie County Sheriff William Bill Presley was the chief lawman on the Texas side of Texarkana and found himself thrust into the biggest case of his life. And Presley was a solid, methodical lawman, a small-town sheriff who was suddenly faced with a potential serial killer. And he, as we know, was the first on the scene, and was the first to coordinate any sort of response to the attacks, starting with Hollis and Larry. And Presley did his best to preserve evidence. He personally pocketed a key piece of evidence from one scene, keeping it secret until a suspect mentioned it, which is just like high-class detective work. But he was also just extremely overwhelmed. This was unprecedented terror for a town like Texarkana, and his office had limited manpower and resources. So recognizing this, Presley readily welcomed outside help, as we know. But as a killer eluded capture week after week, Presley voiced the town's frustration, saying, "This killer is the luckiest person I have ever known. No one sees him, hears him in time, or can identify him in any way," he would tell reporters. The Phantom just seemed to disappear like smoke after each crime, and Sheriff Presley's name would later become part of the legend. But no figure cuts a more flamboyant image than Texas Ranger Captain Manuel T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez. Let's take a little moment from the video to talk about something that has completely changed my sleep game. And honestly, I wish I knew about this sooner. You know how we all use cotton pillowcases without thinking twice? Well, my dermatologist actually let me in on this secret, and she tells all of her patients to ditch cotton for Blissy's silk pillowcases. And the difference is that you'll see less fine lines and healthier hair in just weeks. And by God, was she right. Not to mention, Blissy was just voted Best Gift of 2024, and after using it, I totally get why. First off, it's real silk, not that synthetic satin stuff that's rough on your hair and skin. This is the real dermatologist tested and recommended with actual anti-aging properties that reduce fine lines over time. And my hair is better than ever. And I'm a hairdresser, so I am very anal about my hair. So I haven't been waking up with that crazy bedhead frizz or like damage to my cuticles anymore, thanks to Blissy. It actually preserves my hairstyle overnight and protects my color-treated hair. And plus, it's clinically proven to not clog pores like cotton does. So I've noticed that my skin is actually clearer since using the pillowcase. And the silk fibers naturally hydrate your skin, so your skin stays moisturized all night long. And if you're a hot sleeper like me, I'm a furnace. This pillowcase is naturally cooling and breathable, so no more flipping to the cold side of the pillow. It's just always nice and cool. And it's antibacterial, hypoallergenic, and somehow machine washable, which I did not expect from silk. And they've got over 70 colors to choose from, including a new Wicked and Harry Potter line. So it's no wonder they've been featured on Live with Kelly and Mark and The View and Oprah Daily and Good Morning America, and they have over 3 million sold. I've been using mine for a few months now, and my skin feels softer, my hair isn't breaking like it used to, and I'm actually sleeping better. It's one of those upgrades you don't realize you needed it until you try it. And because you're a listener, Blissy is offering 60 nights risk-free plus an additional 30% off when you shop at blissy.com/CCCM. That's BLISSY.com/CCCM and use code CCCM to get an additional 30% off. Your skin and hair will thank you. Thank you so much to Blissey for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So in 1946, Gonzalez was already a legend. He was a veteran ranger known for his white hat and dramatic flair. And he arrived in Texarkana after the first double murder, and the lone wolf quickly made a striking impression. And the media would quickly gravitate to him because we know the media loves drama. But here was a Hollywood-esque lawman to match the sensational story that they were getting. And Gonzalez did not shy away from the limelight. And he gave colorful quotes to reporters vowing that the killer would be caught and boasting of the ranger's prowess. And the local newspapers ate that shit up. Behind the scenes, however, some colleagues felt Gonzalez was something of a publicity seeker, more interested in looking good for the press than in collaborative detective work. But he was often photographed on the case. And some local officers also grumbled that lone wolf spent more time escorting reporters, especially attractive female reporters, around than actually chasing any leads. But despite the criticism, Gonzalez was an experienced investigator and did contribute to the case, with things like decoy operations, which we'll discuss in a bit. And Gonzalez would patrol back roads night after night as well. And he was also the one to publicly urge residents to arm themselves for protection, and famously advising people to oil up their guns and see if they're loaded, and to not hesitate to shoot if they felt threatened. So this emboldened already anxious citizens, perhaps more than was wise, but reflected Gonzalez's bold, take-no-prisoners persona. So by April 1946, fear had started to take hold in Texarkana, but more was yet to come. And on the night of April 13th, 1946, a Saturday, 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker was playing her saxophone at the local VFW club dance with the Jerry Atkins Band, the Rhythmaries. And Betty Jo was something of a local darling, an outgoing, talented high school junior, and formerly Little Miss Texarkana, known for her musical skills and bright personality. And at around 1:30 a.m., after the dance ended in the early hours of April 14th, which was Sunday morning, Betty Jo's friend, Paul Martin, aged 16, arrived to pick her up. And Paul was a popular boy, a high school junior, and an old friend of Betty Jo's. And he had been out with other friends earlier that night and then swung by to give Betty Jo a ride home. So the two of them left in Paul's coupe. But instead of going straight home, they decided to take a little detour. And it was common for teens to go to Spring Lake Park, a lover's lane type area on the north edge of Texarkana, Texas. And Paul and Betty Jo headed in that direction. But unbeknownst to them, they were being hunted. And by dawn, the young couple had not returned home, and their families got extremely worried. And at approximately 6:30 a.m. on April 14th, a horrifying discovery was made. A family out for an early Sunday drive came upon Paul Martin's body lying by North Park Road, just outside of Spring Lake Park, and Paul was deceased and shot 4 times. And investigators later noted he was shot through the nose, his ribs, right hand, and the back of his neck. And his car was nowhere in sight. So a search party immediately formed to look for Betty Jo, and it took hours of combing through the woods and fields in the vicinity. But at around 11:30 a.m., 2 searchers found Betty Jo Booker's body behind a tree in a wooded area almost 2 miles away from where Paul was found. And she was lying on her back, fully clothed, with her hand in the pocket of her overcoat as if she might have been trying to shield herself or even keep her coat closed. And Betty Jo had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in her face. And the positioning suggested she may have been shot where she was found or possibly moved a very short distance. But it was clear that this attack had unfolded in a very chaotic way, and the 2 teenagers ended up a considerable distance apart, and Paul's car had been driven off completely separately. But Paul's car would eventually be located about 3 miles away from Booker's body, and about 1.5 miles away from his own body, near the edge of Spring Lake Park, with the keys still in the ignition. And it had been left parked and presumably ran out of gas. And this indicated the killer likely commandeered the vehicle at some point, perhaps to confuse investigators or to make his own escape, then just abandoned it. and investigators pieced together the events as best they could. So it appeared Paul Martin's car was parked at Spring Lake Park when the attack began. So likely the killer approached them just as he had the other victims, by surprise under the cover of darkness. And there was evidence of a struggle. Paul Martin, a very courageous kid, may have fought or fled, and blood on the opposite side of the road from his body indicated Paul was moving while bleeding, which supports the idea he was shot and still tried to escape or possibly draw fire away from Betty Jo Booker. And Betty Jo Booker's body suggested the killer had taken time with her, because the fact that her coat was buttoned and hand in pocket could mean she was made to button it, or she did it in a desperate attempt at modesty or warmth before being killed. There was also evidence of possible SA, because reports note that Betty Jo's body did have some bruising in those parts, and there was presence of SA. And this indicated she likely suffered SA or attempted SA before or after death. And forensic analysis in 1946 could confirm SA, but not DNA. So it told them about the crime, but there's nothing they could do with that evidence. And her saxophone was also missing, and only her saxophone case was found at the crime scene initially. And even that wasn't found until much later in the search. So had the Phantom taken it as a trophy, potentially? The absence of the saxophone would later prove to be a key clue. But for now, it was just one more bizarre facet of this double murder. But one consistency emerged, and that is that ballistic tests showed that the .32 caliber bullets that killed Betty Jo and Paul matched the same weapon that killed Richard and Polly. So it was the same gun linking all 4 murders, a .32 caliber pistol, so that was definitive proof that the crimes were connected. So the killer, the serial killer had now murdered 4 people with the same firearm. And the brutality of these killings sent Texarkana into even more shock. And the local newspapers ran sensational headlines. And this was now a second double homicide in 3 weeks. And the pattern was undeniable. A killer was targeting young couples at night, and the use of the car and the separation of the victims showed an escalation in audacity, because the Phantom felt confident enough to take control of a vehicle and drive around after committing 2 murders. Just a sick. So this was a frightening development. He was growing bold and just more unpredictable, and the community's sense of security was completely shattered at this point. And it was after the second double murder that the press gave the unknown perpetrator the famous name, the Phantom Killer. And on April 16th, 1946, the Texarkana Daily News and Gazette ran banner headlines about a Phantom Killer who was on a spree. And the name Phantom was coined by Texarkana Gazette editor Calvin Sutton, who later admitted he chose it for dramatic effect. Big shocker. And because it captured how the killer seemed to strike and disappear like a ghost. But Sutton's sensational moniker stuck immediately, and the newspapers realized that fear sold papers, and they leaned into it. And one Gazette article infamously warned, "Sex maniac hunted," terrifying residents with the idea that a crazed predator was loose. Just scum. Media's just scum. And another screamed that the Phantom Killer eludes officers as investigation of slayings pressed, as the officers and rangers failed to catch the Phantom. And journalists from outside the region descended on Texarkana as well, and the story went national and even international. And many correspondents came to the small town to cover what they dubbed the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. And the case had all the elements of a lurid true crime. Young lovers, a mysterious masked killer, incompetence of powerlessness of police, and a catchy nickname. Just nobody's thinking about the actual people that lost their lives, the children that lost their lives, and the people that are still alive and that were severely affected by this killer. There's just no thought. It's just all about money and selling stuff. It's disgusting. It makes me sick. And radio news broadcasts further spread the alarm. And since radio was the primary home entertainment in 1946, families across the Southwest listened intently to updates about the Phantom. And in Texarkana itself, rumors became even more wild and pervasive thanks to radio and newspaper coverage feeding the frenzy. And Gazette's managing editor, J.Q. Mahaffey, would later reflect, years afterward, that the paper may have contributed to hysteria more than it should have. No f***ing shit! But at the time, the imperative to inform the public and frantically to sell newspapers drove the coverage. And the result was a kind of mass hysteria that modern Texarkana had never experienced. And the Phantom Killer dominated conversation in churches, barbershops, and dinner tables. So with the Phantom nickname, he became almost a supernatural boogeyman in people's minds, an invincible, unseen force that could be anywhere in the dark at any time. And as April turned into May, the community braced itself, wondering when and where the Phantom would strike next. I know we're talking about very serious subject matter, but I want to talk about something else that's very serious, and that is your health. And if you're like me, I'm sure you've put off that doctor's appointment for that weird mole on your back for the past 2 years when you shouldn't have. Or you've neglected to see the dentist for the past 2 years, and you know you haven't been flossing, so you're scared to go, but you should go. But you just keep putting it off. Well, I found something that has helped me tremendously in this space, and that is ZocDoc. ZocDoc makes it easy to find the right doctor right now, and it's all online. You'll probably be able to book an appointment before the end of this ad. But here's the deal. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. And we're talking over 100,000 doctors across every specialty, from mental health to primary care to dental health to urgent care and everything in between. And what I love is how specific you can get with your doctor. You can filter for doctors who take your insurance or are located nearby or are a good fit for whatever medical need you have. And this is huge. They are highly rated by verified patients. Very important and seems to be rare in this sort of space lately, but ZocDoc has you covered. And once you find the right doctor, you see their actual appointment openings, choose a time slot that works for you, and boom, you instantly book a visit. No phone tag, no waiting on hold, no, we'll call you back. And appointments made through ZocDoc happen fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours of booking. I know I needed to find a mental health care professional recently, and I was able to see her the next day, which was incredible. And more often than not, you can even score same-day appointments. But I've used ZocDoc to find a primary care doctor, a mental health care doctor, and my dentist. No lie, I've used it for all the doctors I used recently, and it's been super easy and not stressful. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So by late April 1946, Texarkana was in the grip of mass hysteria, as we know. And after the brutal murders of Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin, an unprecedented fear swept the Twin Cities. And people who once left doors unlocked were now barricading themselves inside their own homes at night. And gun stores and hardware shops had shelves cleared within days, and citizens bought every firearm and box of ammunition that was available. And stores also sold out of window shades, blinds, and padlocks. And guard dogs were in high demand as families sought any form of protection. And at dusk, Texarkana turned into a ghost town. And businesses that used to stay open late, like movie theaters or cafes, began closing earlier and earlier, some by 6 or 7 p.m. And the downtown midnight movie showings were canceled altogether. And curfews were informally imposed by parents on their children and by business owners on their establishments. And the infamous phrase, "the town that dreaded sundown," which would later title an actual movie, was already true in spirit. Because when the sun set, everyone went home, locked their doors, and prayed for morning. And commerce suffered in surrounding areas as well. And one report even noted that even businesses in nearby towns felt the impact of Texarkana's fear-driven shutdowns, because the normally robust social life with dances and picnics and dates and drive-ins was utterly paralyzed by fear. And with police stretched thin and no culprit caught, many townsfolk decided to take matters into their own hands. And teenagers, especially, responded in a mix of fear and bravado. And groups of high school boys armed themselves with deer rifles and formed vigilante patrols, driving around at night hoping to confront the Phantom. And this was extremely dangerous, and not to mention illegal. But it just shows the level of panic. Even kids were hunting the hunter. And homeowners, too, sat on their porches in rocking chairs, cradling shotguns, eyes just scanning the darkness. And it got to the point where police responding to calls had to be extremely careful approaching houses, because officers would pull into a driveway at night, then stand up in the patrol's car headlights and shout, "Hey, it's the fuzz," to avoid getting shot by a jumpy resident. And the police even adopted a protocol of using their siren briefly when arriving to warn homeowners, which is smart, because Texarkana just became a trigger-happy town. And the local police had to caution citizens about this overzealous armed vigilance. And Texas Ranger Gonzalez, Lone Wolf himself, publicly warned against vigilantism, saying, "It's a good way to get killed." And officers knew the last thing they needed was an accidental shooting or some teenager mistakenly killing an innocent person in the dark. Yet, in truth, officials quietly admitted that heavily armed populace was a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, the Phantom would have a hard time breaking into any home without facing a hail of bullets. But on the other hand, the extreme fear could cause tragic and deadly mistakes. So it was chaos born of fear. So the entire community was literally on a hair trigger. But thankfully, despite some close calls, there were no known fatality vigilante accidents, thank goodness. But the tension was palpable. And Texarkana was effectively a town under siege by an unknown assailant, and everyone was armed and sleep deprived. So the frenzied media coverage